Okay, hey everybody. Today I'm going to be describing the Maximal exercise test with direct gas exchange, more commonly known as like a VO2 max test. VO2 max being the measurement that we're looking to get out of the test, but typically it's referred to as a maximal exercise test because you take the person to their absolute volitional withdrawal from the test, or their absolute max where they can no longer maintain the pace or cadence needed. So I'll go into describing everything you need to run the test, and then I'll leave the analysis in a folder in the comments section, and you guys can analyze that. So I'll pop off to the side here, and we'll get started. So what you need before you start the test, I know this is kind of a grainy picture, but honestly, this sort of hodgepodge setup is mostly what it looks like in the lab. So you have a large tube connecting your metabolic cart to your participant here on the bike. They have a one-way valve set, which allows them to inhale room air and then captures their collected exhaled air, which gets analyzed both the flow of it and the absolute concentrations of oxygen and CO2. Those two get multiplied together, so the absolute concentrations times the flow gives you the absolute volume of O2 and CO2 exhaled. That all then gets calculated into the computer, and we have this exact same system called the Parvo True One, and this is a Velotron electromagnetic bike, which we sometimes use as well. So before you get started, you're going to want to make sure that you have disinfected mouthpieces. This is really important, obviously, in COVID more than ever, but at all times, making sure that you have high-level disinfectant. We actually use this, let me get my pointer out here. We use this Preempt now. It's a high-level disinfectant 5, which means it kills all types of viruses, bacteria in 5 minutes. This Sidex OPA is what we used to use. It's also great and used in hospitals all the time. And then General Sidex will also kill all viruses and everything like bacteria, but it's worse for the environment, whereas these two are more neutral, and this one can go down the sink quite easily. So first, you're going to take the mouthpiece off the person, rinse it with soap and water, using the antimicrobial soap to get any actual like particulates off and any soiled parts. Going over it with your hands and scrubbing it, then putting it into the high-level disinfectant for 5 minutes, then a good rinse after the fact. So that's how you would prep it for your participant. You're also going to want personal protective equipment for yourself, the experimenter, typically nitrile gloves and a jacket. Obviously, if it's a COVID situation, you'd also have a mask and glasses, so using a biosafety level 2 type setup. You're going to need the gas collection mouthpiece and tubing. Typically, what we would use in the lab here, which is quote unquote the most secure, because I'll talk about why in a second, but it's essentially a snorkel where the person's mouth goes right over it, just like you would when you're swimming. But it has this supportive headgear, and the head support basically allows that snorkel to be cantilevered out from the person's mouth without being like really encumbering them during the test, because remember, there's going to be a tube attached to that as well. Some of these headgears are actually even attached to a little sort of a gantry coming off the metabolic cart. You'll notice that this one doesn't have the nose plug, but in this type of setup, the nose plug is very important. It's less important in the mask type setups, and this is a Hans Rudolph mask with a T-valve set. So using that same one-way valve set that I described before, where it has a one-way valve to allow the participant to inhale room air, so they're inhaling room air through one valve, and then when they exhale room air, this one-way valve doesn't let it back out that way. It only allows it out this way into where you would attach the tube. This works exactly the same way and is a little bit more comfortable because it fits over the participant's nose and mouth. People typically get dry mouth a lot with this, and this one, it's not pictured, but all of ours have a little cylinder off the bottom, which is a spit valve, and sometimes that doesn't capture all that much. It's just sort of bugging the person, and sometimes that gets filled up in the first quarter of the test and you have to swap it out. So these are more comfortable. They allow the person to sort of manage their saliva load themselves, and this little bonnet sort of supports it against the face, so you avoid this headgear situation. But both of these situations have a large collection tube because they need to preserve the flow of air. So they need to preserve the velocity that your exhaled breath is traveling at all the way to the pneumotachometer, which is essentially a series of screens that pulls air, and basically it measures the difference in pressure between those screens to measure the flow of air. This one you can actually see here has a pneumotach, a different style pneumotach, one that actually uses a fan right on the mouthpiece. So this one is integrated with that pneumotach, and then you can see only has a tiny little set of lines coming out of that to pull the actual concentrations of the gas. So where these ones and the ones we typically use in the lab measure it on the cart, this one measures it on the mask and then only pulls the little sample of gas out that's needed. This one does both on the cart. We do, and again, I say we do use these more. We do recommend against using these mask type ones because they don't always fit amazingly. These blue ones are significantly better. They've made pretty good strides in being a soft mouthpiece and fitting against a person's face, but everybody's face is different, and I always find that right there, right where your nose sort of comes down, everybody's just so different shaped. It's very hard to get a tight fit around there, and you're losing a little bit of gas out of the side, and that's just not giving you as accurate a measurement as you would probably want. Okay, next slide. So you're going to need a heart rate monitor. Again, you're not going to be the person has so much on them. You can check manually for heart rate, and this is where we need your skills to be advanced enough that if something goes wrong with the heart rate monitor, you can check it manually. But you're going to be wanting to have instantaneous heart rate directly input through the heart rate little Bluetooth receiver that's hooked up to the system, because you're going to want that data side by side with your gas exchange data so you can graph it later. So really, if your heart rate monitor conks out, you can monitor the person and see where their heart rate's at, but really you would probably want to just run that test again. Heart rate monitor, really important. Then the next is choosing, obviously, your erg. You need something to increase the load on the person and take them to maximal exercise capacity. And you get to sort of choose. We have an assortment in the lab of treadmills and cycle ergometers. We don't have other ergometers, but I know if someone was a skier or a rower, or other things I can't even think of, you could use ergs that are that's more sport specific, and as long as it has a way to sort of very tightly control the intensity of the exercise and ramp the person up in that intensity and hold them there, that's fine as well. Then you're going to need an RPE chart, because you're going to need to monitor the person's RPE, knowing when they're getting close to ending the test and actually sort of pushing them right into that zone and encouraging them. And optionally, a blood pressure cuff and stethoscope if you want to collect blood pressures as well. Again, this test is already pretty cumbersome, and if you were concerned about someone's blood pressure, you probably wouldn't be giving them a maximal test right away. This is sometimes done in a cardiac outpatient facility and other cardiac testing in hospital situations. But then again, they're not necessarily concerned with the person's absolute metabolic load at that point. They're more concerned with running an ECG at the same time, and the metabolic measures are secondary to the blood pressure and cardiac measures. You're going to need your data input chart ready, because you're going to need to be inputting RPE, and if you're taking blood pressure, like I said, for these you can palpate the odd heart rate, but you're going to have heart rate being directly input into the computer program through that Bluetooth receiver, so you don't necessarily need that, but it's there if you need it. The big part about this is you're going to need to decide what your exercise protocol is. So for this test, which I'm going to show you, it was a running test where I was a self-selected speed actually, so we filled in the chart after the fact with the 7.5 miles an hour, and we knew that we were going up 2 degrees incline every 2 minutes. So that gets really hard, around the 6 to 8%, and then it drops back down to 3.5 for the warm-up. But you can do that where you just play with your protocol and find one that works for you. There's no really strict measures. There's obviously a ton that have been published and researched to be very effective in getting certain populations to where they need to be. Picking the exact protocol is important in I would say more important in a indirect, because you need to achieve those steady states in order to plot your data points. Really, in a direct maximal test, it's about pushing the person to their absolute max. So you don't want them to ramp up too fast or too slow, but exactly how they get to the 8 to 12 minutes part is a little bit more free form there. So yeah, again, we're aiming for that roughly 8 to 12 minute sweet spot, not including warm up, in terms of having the person not ramp up too fast in that the load is on too hard on their muscles and you get volitional fatigue and quitting, and you don't have them tire out too much, because they're just generally fatiguing and they're not actually aerobically fatiguing quite yet. The last thing you're going to need is your participants' PARQ plus. You want to make sure they don't have any contraindications beforehand, their height, their weight, and age to compare to normal data after the fact. You actually need their weight because it does some calculations. Obviously, VO2 is expressed in milliliters per kilogram per minute, so the computer program needs to know their weight in order to do that and output that data for you. Okay, so I'm going to show the video here. And okay, so what's going on here is Ian is calibrating the machine. So you can see that he's using a large syringe, a 3-liter syringe, hooked up to that mouthpiece that I will be wearing. And you can see the headgear over here without the mouthpiece on it. So just like the person would be breathing through it, he's pushing 3 liters of air each time at different speeds through the syringe to calibrate the flow of the unit. There's also a little gas tank on the side of the unit which calibrates it to known gas concentrations, because the unit just measures everything in voltages. So you have to tell it that this voltage, which it's measuring, is 20% oxygen, and this voltage is 70 liters per minute. So that's how we do that. You can see I was off to the side here getting the heart rate monitor situated, and Ian is now taking the syringe and putting that away, taking the mouthpiece, and then I'll get that on in a second. Okay, so having the participant hop onto the treadmill. You would generally be doing more of this, but I'll sort of describe it as I'm doing it as well. We can't have too many people in the lab right now, so I get to do some of this myself while Ian is helping me out. But this is the little snorkel piece, which I just brought out from the prep room, all sanitized. And again, I'm touching this, so that's fine. You wouldn't want to touch it with your bare hands and then give it to your participant. Ian has gloves on, so he's putting gloves on to take it from me afterwards. But I would probably have gloves on when I gave it to them as well. So that goes in your mouth, lips all the way around it. And then basically, and then basically each side, the supports they slide over top of it, and then when you tighten the back of it, it also has these little adjustments on the side that really support it. I like to have the person hold the mouthpiece up to where it feels comfortable for them, not too far back, pushed into their mouth, not too far out that it's like pulling out of their lips, and then not so much that sort of dragging, pulling down, because again, the pipe will be attached to it. And then you adjust those side pieces to make sure that it's supporting them. So that's what I'm doing there, making sure that it's comfortable. Ian is bringing me a sanitized nose clip. I always put it on once. It almost always is super itchy. And right there I described that inhaled air goes in the white white valve, and exhaled air is coming out the clear one. So we're putting the pipe on the clear one because we want to capture our exhaled air. And again, I've done this enough times that I'm kind of particular. I can reach it over and sort of adjust the pipe because I know I don't want it to pull on my head too much. Ian is helping me out, and I always try and get the participants situated as comfortable as possible, because as soon as they start running and now you're halfway through the test and they're tugging on the pipe or like trying to say something to you, everything sounds like woo, 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 woo. So you can only pretty much ask yes or no questions and they give you thumbs up, thumbs down. It's very hard to figure out what an issue is, especially if you have a person in one time. We've had a lot of people come in where it's an NHL player prepping for the combine, it's someone who's being referred to us and comes from out of province or something, and they're really only there for one day. You can't necessarily run a second one of these in one day, in the same day, if the person's exhausted. You could, but it's definitely not ideal, and you want to get as much out of it as possible in one shot. So here Ian is putting in my age, height, and weight. He didn't know this to put it in beforehand, so I'm trying to communicate. And again, you can see that I can't talk to him, so I'm having to communicate my height in centimeters through hand gestures. Okay, so what it's going to do is wait for the computer to calibrate to baseline and for the measures just to flatten out here before we start the test. You can see that the treadmill's already rolling under me. I'm just making sure that I'm actually not breathing into it. Put the tube on a little bit prematurely there, but it needs to sample room air just to start and just make sure we have baseline levels, and then I'll put that tube back on. So while we're waiting for this, I watched this video back, and I was trying to change my running style, and watching it back, it's horrible. You never watch yourself run, and I never want to again. Never have somebody video you run, especially if you're sort of self-critical about that. Here I'm taping the heart rate monitor, or the little Bluetooth receiver for the heart rate monitor, a bit closer. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll hang it right there from the little gantry. I think that works pretty well. Sometimes if it's not necessarily working great with the person's heart rate monitor, I'll tape it right to the front of the treadmill. So it's basically as close as possible to them. You just really don't want to miss out on any signal. Again, we have the representation, what the data collection program looks like here. You can see that there was no data coming through because I wasn't exhaling. And you can see me signaling to Ian here that there's a little problem with the heart rate monitor. We should see it popping up here. And this is where knowing what to look for is really important, because if you just saw, okay, we're getting a couple data points, we're getting exhaled air because I'm breathing through it, the program will let you start. So if we can't see heart rate and we don't have any heart rate data to graph, this test would basically be moot. So knowing your program and knowing where the data is supposed to come up and what common issues are is really important. So here Ian brought over a heart rate monitor watch, which did work. So we know that it's not the strap. And then one other thing I'm testing here is just making sure that the heart rate monitor is wet under the strap. That's sometimes a common issue as well. So again, I wanted to leave this in because this is pretty typical for I like to do a lot of the troubleshooting before we start the test. It's fairly typical for you to not put something on participant and it just work right away. This is nice because I'm looking at it as well and knowing exactly what's going on. You can see that Ian's also doing his job, getting everything ready, making sure that the system is calibrated. And now we can see that once I wet it, we had peaks here, so it is collecting heart rate. So that's good. So it'll give us our heart rate values off to the side right here, so you can watch those. And you'll probably have to make that full screen to see them, but yeah, right now it's 82. So I'm already moving around a little bit. My general resting is like high 40s, low 50s. So already up almost 30 beats there. And okay, now we're starting the warm up because everything's good to go. But yeah, again, this is like a sort of very typical test, and you really need to know what to look for. We were very prepped in terms of having the protocol and everything ready, and Ian was doing all that. So it just helps to have that second set of eyes. But again, sometimes you might be running this kind of alone. I wouldn't recommend it, because if something were to happen, you always want somebody else to be able to help you troubleshoot. Like, let's say I have to swap out that spit valve on the bottom because the person is like a super spitty person. You unscrew that, and now you have to take that out to the sink. You obviously don't want it running all over them. Having a second set of hands to grab another one and swap that in is very handy. And you can see how Ian's walking in and out and just checking, making sure that everything looks good. Writing down my pace during the first stages here. And I think now that we're good to go, I'm going to skip ahead out of the warm-up and get into our first stage. So I've confirmed that everything looks good here. So I typically do what Ian does, where you reach across and you adjust it for the participant. In the first couple stages, it's not unheard of that if the participant is very comfortable, they could help you adjust it for them. But into the later stage of the test, they're not going to want to adjust it, and they're not necessarily going to adjust it right when you say. So very much at that time, you're going to be reaching across. I like to also tape their RPE questionnaire right in front of them sometimes, and then that way they can just point at it, because you're not going to be able to necessarily communicate with them, like I said. And again, here's my weird running form to reduce knee impact, and honestly I might go back. Okay, so that is essentially a very good demo, I think, of what the setup of a VO2 direct test would look like. Now we're into what the actual test looks like, and you can watch this data. This is basically like a time synced output from the screen that we recorded, and you can see the data is quite stochastic. Breath to breath data is going to be very messy and all over the place. So that's why when you're analyzing the data after the fact, you're going to use moving averages or filters to smooth it a little bit. And in terms of what you use, I'll let Dr. Dogra talk about that in the research, but there are a couple different techniques, and I don't necessarily want to push you guys to analyze the data one way or the other, but there are different ways to do it, and we have different ways that we like to do it. You can see here that there's not too much slack in the tube. It's bouncing, but not all over the place. Ian held up the sheet, and it's hard to get the person to pinpoint one. You could see I'm pretty practiced at it, and I was bouncing sort of between two RPE levels. So you kind of got to just know your participant and take one of the ones that they're sort of on the longest. Ian went to move the crane a little bit there because he thought that it was shaking a little bit too much. It sort of pulled more than I would have liked. And I'm just going to slide this back over here because we're sort of into the test now. So you don't need to see too much of me running, but making sure that you're looking at what Ian's doing is just as important here. He's constantly monitoring back and forth, watches head movements, watching me, then looking back at the screen. Taking especially note of the heart rate and the time of the test, the total running time, which is off here, up top. Making sure the data looks semi-normal, making sure that there's not a off-the-charts VE. If there's a V of 200, something's wrong. If there's a V of 20, something's wrong at this point in the test. Making sure that the VO2 values don't seem insanely high or low. Just sort of having an eye for it really could help you out here in not burning the person out. If he stopped me at this point in the test and said, whoa, something's wrong, I'm getting really, really low VO2s, maybe something went wrong with our calibration, I wouldn't be that tired. I've only run for 2 minutes here. If he let me go the entire test and then we found out that, oh, he just didn't necessarily know that this was too high or too low until he analyzed the data, then that's a little bit more of an issue. Okay, so again, taking note of the time, he gets me to show my next RPE, writes that down. And again here, if you're not taking blood pressure, you're really monitoring the participant, increasing the load. So increasing, just in this case, not speed, just incline, and taking their RPE and monitoring them, making sure that everything's working. Okay, so heart rate's getting up there. I'm at 173 now. Again, I'm 30. It is probably a theoretical max of 190. I don't always train with heart rate monitor, so I can't exactly tell you what my heart rate max is. But getting up there. And this is where you really get to sort of, yeah, I haven't run in a while, so my legs were screaming here. But this is where Ian can sort of see my stride start to change, be a bit more labored, especially a bit more movement in the upper body, a bit more sway in the hips. And as soon as he can start to see that, then he can start to verbally encourage, say, okay, come on, you can get through this stage and another, that's no problem. Okay, checking time here. Looking like a pretty good linear increase. Our protocol isn't ramped way too quickly. Obviously, there's going to be a more sudden onset in VO2 right at the start of the test, but then you want this sort of fairly linear progression. It's not absolutely flat. The person's constantly working harder and harder. Okay, so I think I was around, you can see that, yeah, I was getting pretty high there. The little box did pop up and said end test, so Ian had to monitor that and make sure that he didn't click yes. So stuff like that happens. A little pop-up box comes up and you need to make sure that you read it and don't click yes, end test, like halfway through. All right, I think I'm getting kind of labored here. You can see, especially my foot strike seems to not be nearly as gentle. I'm sort of running a little louder, or like, yeah, not as soft. And you can really start to see it get labored here. I try and change my stride a little bit longer, really trying to gut out the last little bit. And my heart rate's still going up. My legs just seem to be fried that day, and just haven't run in a while in the winter, but Ian asked me how I'm doing, gave him the thumbs up, said, can go for a little more. And he's holding this up with his hand. I guess the little Velcro strap we had that was supporting this fell off. They're not always the most secure things in the world. So sometimes if he had tape handy, he could just tape it. But right now, he didn't have tape handy, and because it was just me and him, he can't leave. So now he's got to hold that up with one hand, get the RP with the other hand. And there, I was just saying, I'm too gassed, I can't keep up. So then he reaches across. I typically leave the mouthpiece in a little bit just to get a little bit of the cool down. People want it out right away. I cannot stress this enough. They want it out right away. It is very uncomfortable to have it in your mouth during the test, let alone after you're done and you've just quit and you're super sweaty and it's full of spit. You can see my spit valve's only about halfway. I'm telling you, some people will fill that up twice in a thing and they'll be overflowing, sloshing around in the mouthpiece. So first thing I like to do, probably have the person straddle. I didn't necessarily, I'll help Ian out there, but you reach back, crank that off behind their head, and then roll it forward, and then take some Kim wipes and jam it up under them to catch that drip of spit. Then you can see he's holding that over the garbage right away. We slide a garbage in between. He'll pop that tube off, and then again, it should be just condensation in the tube, but there will be a lot of condensation. So he's gonna let that sit just right in that empty garbage bag to drain out. I don't know necessarily what I'm saying here, probably something along the lines of that really sucked. I think it's the first one I'd done in 8 months or something. but it wasn't all that bad. So there you can see Ian walk away with some Kim wipes jammed into the mouthpiece, because you don't want the person's saliva running down your arms as you take it into the sink or prep area. And yeah, this is a pretty common after sight of the test, so I figured I'd leave that in. Usually you're right there when the person's doing that. So again, you really get this with the snorkel. You get the most accuracy, the least air leak, but you get this very sort of chalky mouth feel afterwards, because it doesn't really allow you to spit or sort of like manage how your mouth dries out. So yeah, that's how we would run a test. I would walk for a little bit longer on a cool down, and whoop, I'll escape that here. And the last, go over here. The last part is this is what the data looks like when we do an Excel export. I typically export it as breath by breath. The program has the options to do some smoothing right in it. But what that's doing is that's basically eliminating any raw data that you would have. I would at least export a raw and then a smoothed as well, or just do the smoothing myself in Excel after the fact with averaging and downsampling all of these. It gives you all the measures you input in the calibration phase. It gives you participant metrics up top here, and you can see that we have our heart rate over here. And remember, at the start of the test, we weren't picking something up and there was a problem, so it zeros. But then if I were to scroll down here, I would see that there is heart rate data embedded in this. And again, I'll leave that in a Google Drive folder in the comments section. Thanks for watching.